Welcome to another episode of Clean Water Champions, a virtual clean water celebration. I'm your host, Brian Fox-Ellis, and today our field trip takes us to Dixon Mounds Museum, where the Spoon River joins the Illinois River, where there was once a mighty culture that lived there for 1,000 years. What can we learn from our ancestors, the ones who lived here before us, and their relationship to rivers and waterways? By studying the objects, the archaeology, asking the right kinds of questions, we can learn more, as Dr. Michael Wiant will show us.
I'm Michael Wiant. For 50 years, I've studied the archaeology of the Illinois River Valley, interested in the lives of Native Americans who've lived in this river valley for 12,000 years. The river valley here, like many river valleys around the world, are the places where human societies have grown up and developed the civilizations that we enjoy today. Looking at that record reminds us that there are critical resources on the landscape that people all around the world require to survive. They're basic needs that people have been attentive to for a long time. Needs such as water and clothing, food, shelter, and forms of energy. When we look at the archaeological record, the way of life of Native people that have lived in this river valley, one of the things that we notice is that their communities are often situated strategically, located where they have access to those basic need resources to be sure that they can sustain their life over time. When I was asked to consider making a presentation at the Clean Water Celebration, I wanted to build on those 50 years of looking at the archaeological record and develop a story that I could share with young people today to give them pause about the world that they live in and how they relate to the natural resources that sustain their lives, asking them, in fact, what are your basic needs? And how today do you meet those basic needs? And then I would use stories from the past to give them an idea about how that relationship between people has changed over time and how they may consider rethinking their relationship to the world around them. So let's begin with the deepest time perspective of this. Archaeologists learn about the past because they learn to do something that we all do relatively naturally, and that is to read. But instead of reading words, archaeologists have learned to read objects. And by looking at objects, they can relate a story about how people made those objects, how they used those objects to sustain their lives, and then how use of objects over time changed as the relationship between people and the world around them changed. When we look then at objects, what I've done in the past is to bring some objects into the lecture room and ask students to identify them, and then to relate what that object is with respect to their basic needs. How does this object provide access to a basic need to sustain life? And so, in a sense, I taught them to be archaeologists very quickly. I asked them, can you do math? Yes. Can you write? Yes. Can you read? Yes, we can. Well, those are the things the archaeologist does. We simply learn to read objects as well as words. When we look at the record then, we know that water becomes an incredibly important basic primary resource, not only for hydration, but also because of the variety of plants and animals that are associated with water, their basic needs that people relied on. And so when we look at the record, what we see is that people depended on fish, for example. There are thousands of fish bones in ancient villages that were lived in 4,000 and 5,000 and 6,000 years ago in this river valley. There are the skeletal remains of aquatic mammals, animals such as river otter, for example. We see reptiles, turtles, for example. We see the remains of birds, birds such as swans and ducks. All of these would play a role in everyday life. One of the things we learned by studying some of these villages is that they moved at different times. And one of the reasons that they moved is that they began to consume resources more quickly than they could be renewed. Let me give you an example. In some of the historic tribes in the Midwest, for example, one of the key resources would be firewood. When enough wood was consumed in a particular area, the group would move to a new location where they had access to those resources. What that means in today's society is noteworthy because we're consuming natural resources at a very rapid rate. One of the challenges we have, however, is that we don't have the ability to pick up and move. So in the distant past, when resource became an issue, people would move their communities to a new location. Today, that movement is not possible. And what it means is we need to be much more careful about resources, to consume them conservatively, to care for them so that they're renewable. So where water is concerned, as an example, one of the things we need to make sure is that the quality of water is sustained over time. Not only for ourselves, but all of the creatures that take advantage and need water as one of their basic needs. What can you do when you think about this? Well, learning from the archaeological record, we recognize that Native people were intimately tied to nature. Their everyday lives depended on it. They sustained their lives based on their understanding and knowledge of nature, and recognized that their knowledge of nature was key to their long-term survival and their acquisition of materials to sustain their basic needs. What this means then today is that we're connected to nature all around the world, not just simply around our community. And we need to be sensitive about where those materials that we use to sustain our basic needs come from. They come from not only water locally, but they may come from plant materials, animals, other resources that are found elsewhere in the world. And so, where Native people were concerned about the locality that they lived in, now we have to be cognizant of the fact that these resources come from around the globe. What can you do? Learn more about nature. Learn about how nature works. Learn about how people are related to nature and how they depend on nature. Once you begin to understand the workings of nature, you can do more to use it in a careful way and to sustain it. By doing so, we ensure the long-term value of nature and its ability to sustain our way of life. Read a book about nature. Understand how ecology works, what an ecosystem is, how plants and animals are related to the world that they live in, and how people also fit into that world. Study the use of water, the way we use it, how it gets cleaned, how it's put back into place, and what we need to do to ensure that its quality is sustained over time. The past is the foundation upon which we built the future. Archaeologists have given you a picture of the past that tells us that the relationship between humanity and the world around it is absolutely essential to our well-being. You now can learn from the past and from the present to look towards the future, to understand the relationship between humanity and the natural resources that sustain our way of life.
So this is an arrowhead that was collected here. And we know that it's a quartzite. We know the time period in which it was made. We know that the minerals were actually mined far away and traveled via the rivers. Every object tells a story. You volunteering to help with archaeology in your community could help to study the ancient ways. How could they help us be better humans today? What can we learn from our ancestors to be a clean water champion?